Let me ask you a question. Which do you prefer, the country or the city? Okay, so I'm sure your answer is going to depend on what sort of activity you have in mind. If we want to spend a few days away from the hustle and bustle of the city, we'd probably choose the countryside. But if instead we think about day-to-day life, undertaking our own business projects, or going on a night out, the answer is probably going to change completely. Don't fool yourself, we all like cities, and that's got consequences. For the first time ever in history, more than half the world's population lives in cities. Cities have emerged as the nuclei in which people, completely unknown to each other and of various origins, coexist and coordinate their lives to fulfill their goals. Who hasn't felt amazed by the hustle and bustle of London, of New York, of Tokyo? It's a huge mix of cultures, religions, and nationalities. Cities are made up of very different people, but many have something in common, and that's the desire to grow as a society. And it's pretty amazing. Without thinking about it, or in many cases without even being aware of it, we contribute to the welfare of a lot of people we don't even know, and they do the same in return by providing a lot of services that we need. It is precisely for this reason, folks, that cities have been consolidated as the axis, the nucleus, the engine in the freest and most prosperous human society model that humanity has ever known. But does the growth of cities today pose a threat to the rural world? Are cities meeting the needs of their residents? And how is global urbanization affecting people's lives? Well, let's take a look, shall we?
From the countryside to the city.
From the countryside to the city. I'm sure many of you have grandparents or great-grandparents who were born and lived in a village, because the migration from the countryside to the city has been a relatively recent phenomenon. You all know this. Historically, humans lived scattered in small communities where life was based on subsistence farming and whatever products they were able to produce. If you were lucky, you might have your own plot of land where you'd raise a few animals and plant a few vegetables, which you'd later consume. As you can imagine, life was very, very hard. People spent their lives working from childhood to try and get ahead, often with no chance of ever securing a better life. And what's more, the risk of external factors making life worse was extremely high. For example, drought or flood could lead to a terrible famine that could end the lives of thousands upon thousands of people. Not to mention wars, invasion, and of course, disease. That's why, among other things, mortality was so high in the past. So, would you like to go back to the good old days? Probably not, right? I mean, don't kid yourself. In 99% of cases, things were much worse. In general, cities offer us a higher quality of life and a range of opportunities. It all began with industrialization back in the 18th and 19th centuries, which also led to a boom in trade and technological innovations. In that era, cities began to grow exponentially by attracting millions of people from the countryside who wanted to improve their living conditions. And that's the definition of urbanization, a massive transfer of people from the countryside to the city that has been happening continuously for more than 2 centuries. It's a process that has allowed many completely new economic activities to flourish, improving everyone's lives. Since as recently as the 1960s, the world's urban population has multiplied by 4, while the rural population has grown very slowly and has almost reached its tipping point. It's estimated that between 2025 and 2030, the world's rural population will begin to shrink for the first time in the history of mankind. So far, it's decreased in relative terms, but now it will also begin to do so in absolute terms. Basically, we live in a world of cities. Now, how might this change affect us? Well, obviously, in order to live, we need goods to be produced in the countryside, in particular food. And this leads us to a big question that comes up every once in a while, and that's, can a world of cities feed the planet's growing population? Does this urbanization process threaten our food security? Now, a lot of people say yes, but we're not so sure. So a question we need to ask ourselves is, are we producing food in the same way we did 50 years ago? The short answer is no, we're not. Nowadays, we don't need 10, 20 or 30 farmers to plow a couple of hectares of land. John Deere 8285R is just more than enough. This has a name you've probably heard: mechanization. This is new technologies being used, which incidentally tend to be developed in the cities, and they've brought tremendous improvements to the rural environment, improvements that of course translate into a better quality of life. In the countryside, mechanization has greatly reduced the number of workers required in the fields, not only maintaining but even increasing agricultural production. That's exactly why Malthusian theories, the theories that claim the world is suffering from overpopulation and that we don't have the resources to feed everyone, fail over and over and over again. However, hold on a second, folks, because as you might imagine, this population explosion creates many challenges in the cities, especially in developing countries. The main one is urban poverty, caused among other things by the scarcity of housing that occurs in extreme cases of urban explosion, which we're going to take a closer look at in a minute. But despite these challenges and problems, have you ever wondered what exactly is the big attraction that cities offer that leads so many people to move to them? Well, listen up.
Cities, cooperation hubs.
Why did industrialization emerge in cities? Why are the head offices of major companies always in the largest cities? Well, it's not only about having access to better infrastructure, such as roads, ports, or airports, but also about having easy access to all of us. That's human resources. Companies need a lot of different profiles, different people, to be able to function. Have you ever wondered how many people are involved in the creation of just one everyday product? Say, for example, a car. You need engineers, mechanics, designers, even leather tanners and artisans for the vehicle's interior details. That's precisely why the biggest cities, where more people of different profiles coexist, are the ideal place to find human resources. The more professionals and different profiles there are, the more attractive the place is going to be. Cities have become true hubs of human cooperation, where we fill the needs of others and they, in turn, supply us with what we lack. All this without even knowing us. It's rather incredible. These hubs of businesses, entrepreneurship, and consumers have triggered economic growth. Now, at this point, there's a question we need to ask ourselves here on VisualPolitik, and that's, where is this phenomenon happening most markedly? Do you know? Can you guess? Well, I'm sure it's not going to surprise you, because it's happening in Asia. But hold on a second, because Africa is already catching up. And this is hardly surprising. Since the beginning of urbanization, the income per capita for the most urbanized Asian countries has skyrocketed. Urbanization is directly related to economic development. The great amount of knowledge, goods, and services exchanges that take place in cities was something unknown to mankind until very recently. They're something of a modern miracle. Asian countries that have experienced greater migrations from the countryside to the city have seen their citizens' per capita income skyrocket. That's the case in South Korea, Thailand, Japan, and Malaysia, among others. Check out this chart. The greater the concentration of inhabitants, the higher the country's per capita income. And the variation in just 10 years between 2000 and 2010 leaves no room for doubt. But these aren't isolated cases. This phenomenon has extended throughout the developed world. Western Europe, for example, was by far the first place to experience urbanization, doubling and even tripling the rate of urbanization found in the rest of the world. In other words, to a large extent, the old continent's success can be attributed to its pioneering bet on cities. In fact, with this data in hand, the first thing that may come to mind is how it is surprising that it took so long for the other regions to join this phenomenon and yet achieve similar results so quickly. And it's not just an economic issue, not at all. Science, culture, and political freedoms have almost always originated in cities. Cooperation between human beings is easier and simpler in these spaces, making it easier for creativity, serendipity, and influential political movements to emerge. And of course, this is no surprise. In a village, being different or thinking differently can make you an outcast. In cities, you become one more part of an artistic, intellectual, or political movement. It's really that simple. Now, hold on just a second. I mean, how can we accommodate millions of rural people in cities without having the necessary housing, infrastructure, and services? In India, well, they know a bit about this challenge.
India. Explosive urbanization.
So, we've already talked about this here on VisualPolitik. India is starting to become a manufacturing powerhouse. It's beginning to take its first steps towards becoming China's competitor. For example, Apple has already announced that it'll stop manufacturing the new iPhone in China to do it in India instead, which is pretty incredible, actually.
Foxconn is said close to trial output of newest iPhones in India.
And of course, India's industrialization will require a lot of workers, people who are arriving en masse from the countryside to the cities. The urbanization phenomenon is happening so rapidly that in India and in many other cities of the developing world, guaranteeing access to basic services such as electricity, running water, education, health, and infrastructure is posing gigantic problems as it requires huge investment. And this investment poses quite a challenge in some countries. For example, Delhi gets around 700,000 new residents every single year and already has more than 27 million inhabitants in its metropolitan area. Its growth is so astronomical that by 2028 it could become the largest megacity in the world, surpassing even Tokyo. But hold on just a second, how can homes for 700,000 people be built in a single year? And what's more, how can it be done year after year after year? In India, urbanization is happening very quickly, and this entails difficulties in guaranteeing access to housing for all the people arriving in the city. Due to this, it's estimated that 24% of the urban population lives in shantytowns without even the most basic living conditions. Basically, in order to accommodate all of Delhi's new inhabitants, you'd need to build between 700 and 900 million square meters of accommodations every single year. This works out to something roughly the size of Chicago being built every year. So now we have to ask, is this even possible? It seems like a complicated challenge, and unfortunately many newcomers, they're forced to live in those shantytowns which are better known as slums. In Lalbagh, the largest slum in Delhi, more than 300,000 people live in a single square kilometer. It's really quite horrific. Despite the Indian government's efforts to build houses to relocate the poorest, the challenge is so huge that it's like fighting against the clock to reduce something that just doesn't stop growing.